be looking at Israel this morning. This is a topic that I would say is a hot potato. There's very complex background to the story of Israel, the current situation, and it's a very polarizing topic too. We find a lot of very overtly emotional responses to what's happened and the positions of both Palestinians and Israel. So turn, if you have your Bible, to Luke 21:20. This is what they call the Olivet Discourse. This is mirrored, if you like, in Matthew 24 and Mark 13. We looked at some of it in the World of the End book study with Dr. David Jeremiah. And this prophecy here, because that's what it is full of incredible detail. So it starts in 21 verse 20. I've lost it, Jay. Here we go. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these days are days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. Alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. For there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So since the events have gone on since October 7, I've been watching and looking, trying in the very limited knowledge that I have, to see if there's a bigger picture that we can look at to see, is there another marker taking place on the timeline to suggest that we are in end times? Is this just happenstance, or is this all part of the jigsaw puzzle that is being laid out here by the Lord for the end time before he returns? And I think I'll explain at the end why I think it is. But I have to say at the beginning, before we get into the information here, that the actions of Hamas were horrendous. I think anyone with any shred of decency will say that it was horrific viewing what took place. No doubt. We grieve with the Israelis that have lost loved ones. We also feel tremendously for those that have family that have been captured. That the longer it goes on, the more grim the outlook might be for them. So we feel for them. We also, and I've personally been horrified by the brutal response of Israel. No power, no water in Palestine, bombed churches, hospitals. We're down to one last working hospital with no power, just generators. Under bombardment. And our prayer really should be that all parties can find a peaceful solution to stop this escalating to a wider conflict, which it has all the propensity to do. And right at the heart of that issue is the occupation of what they call Palestine. So Paul says, Jay, could you give that back to me? I've still not got it. Can you click on the screen so I can get it? Okay, sorry. Okay, I got it. No, I haven't. Okay. Romans 12:18. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. This is to Christian believers. As far as we are concerned, that is the end game for us. We should always strive to be peacemakers. And really, it's another reflection of the gospel in that we sacrifice our own opinion and our own stake in a situation to make sure that peace is brought about. Not not through injustice, but just if we have the opportunity to stand down, really that's what the Lord will call us to do. Now, I did visit Israel in 2013, and I also tried to cross into Gaza to see for myself what it was really like. I was unable to do it, but Gaza itself is surrounded by walls such as this. Next one. Those Palestinians that want to work in Israel have to go through a lot of tunnels of man-made fences, going through security checkpoints. Some of them are there at 3:30 in the morning, and it will take them almost 2-3 hours to go through a checkpoint to get into Israel to work, to then return and do the same thing over and over again. And it's been like that for decades. This is part of the fencing. It's hugely populated. In fact, they say it's one of the most densely populated areas on the planet. There's 2.2 million people there. They have no airport. They have no port that they control themselves. Only Israeli checkpoints. And I've been up to a checkpoint and I've seen, and it's a scary thing. It's a scary thing to even come near something like that. When I wanted to cross over and go there, that was at the Dome of the Rock area to go through. And the IDF do have a reputation for being merciless. So every day, Palestinians wish to raise their family, and I think we can all understand that, even though we've been told that, most of them are terrorists. It's just not the case. They are regular people wishing to raise their children, but in this situation that they have, surrounded by barbed wire, every piece of good that comes in there is controlled. They really do have very little future to move on, to flourish in that situation. And you might say, hey, you're beginning to sound like a bit of a bleeding heart liberal. So I want us to have a look at this video first. This is by a Jewish guy called Gabor Mate. And if you want to hear the whole video, the whole interview, which is stunning in his presentation of the situation, then I will pass it to you. But we're just going to look at a snippet now. Video 1, Jay.
Teenage years in Canada, I became a Zionist. This dream of the Jewish people resurrected in their historical homeland, and the barbed wire of Auschwitz being replaced by the boundaries of a Jewish state with a powerful army. I found it liberating. It was exhilarating to believe in that dream. And I absorbed all that perspective and all that point of view, and I really believed in it. And then I found out that it wasn't exactly like that. That in order to make this Jewish dream a reality, we had to visit a nightmare on the local population. You couldn't, there was a Zionist slogan called a land without a people for a people without a land. But there was no land without a people. There was people living there who'd been living there for hundreds and years or even longer. And and there's no way you could have ever created a Jewish state without oppressing and expelling the local populations, which is Israeli historians, Jewish Israeli historians, have shown without a doubt that the expulsion of the Palestinians was persistent, it was pervasive, it was cruel, it was murderous, and with deliberate attempt. Once I became aware of all this, I was, okay, well, yeah, we created this beautiful dream, but we imposed a nightmare on somebody else. And then I visited the occupied territories, Russell, during the first Intifada. I cried every day for 2 weeks at what I saw. The brutality of the occupation, the petty harassment, the murderousness of it, the burning down of Palestinian or cutting down of Palestinian olive groves, the denial of water rights, the humiliations. And this went on, and it's much worse now than it was then. It's the longest ethnic cleansing operation in the 20th and 21st centuries. It's still going on.
So what we see as a rebuttal to that from Israel's position is security, right? And you might say, hey, Deep, but what about the terrorists? And my position would be, any act of violence will never produce a wholly good outcome. It will never, wholly as in W-H-O-L-L-Y, wholly, complete, will never bring that about. In fact, the definition of terrorism is a violent act against civilians designed to bring about a political end. It's interesting that even the international community has will not decide on a definitive definition for terrorism, because most of them carry out acts of terrorism to some degree or another. So they all really do point at each other. But this will be generally the recognized definition at the moment. A violent act against civilians designed to bring about a political end. There's another slogan that you've probably heard. It says, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And before we get too upset about that idea, we have to, lost it. We have to remember the Sons of Liberty. Do we remember the Sons of Liberty? Yeah, Samuel Adams back in the 1760s was designated a terrorist by the British because he, if you remember the slogan, it was no taxation without representation. And the Americans started to rebel against the overt use of force by the British, and they wanted emancipation from the British. They wanted their own country. They wanted to govern themselves and develop as they saw fit. But they were labeled terrorists. Now, I grew up in Britain, and my teenage years were in the 80s, and often on the news we would hear of things going on in Northern Ireland, right? The British occupation of Northern Ireland, and groups such as this, which was the Ireland Republican Army, or Irish Republican Army, they were designated terrorists by the British. They would see themselves, and have always done, as freedom fighters. They wanted to bring about the change in governmental policy, and they sought to do that in the end by violent action because their voices were not heard. So there was another group there called Sinn Féin, which now has become a recognized party. And it's bizarre. It would be like here in America hearing that Al-Qaeda now is a recognized political party. That's how insane that kind of idea is. But here, this was 1993. I was living in London, and I was with a friend of mine in the place that we were renting. I was literally maybe 4 minutes from this area. This is called Bishopsgate. It's in the City of London. The City of London is not like London Centre. It's actually the financial district of London. So during the evening, it's very empty. And I remember the whole place shook when the bomb went off inside the house that I was living. And we ran up. I was young and stupid. I was 24. And with my friend, we wanted to find out what was going on. We came out of our house. We could see the smoke above the city. We ran toward it. And we had visions of maybe, rescuing people out of burning buildings and things like this. But the most bizarre thing is, as we were coming down this road, it was the most surreal experience in that it was completely vacant of anybody, but there was glass everywhere. The shock had blown out all the glass. So here we are running down the road looking for where the epicenter might be. There was no one there. It was a bizarre experience. And as in about 10 or 15 minutes, then the police started to arrive, the bomb squad came, and we were moved on. But it was a kind of wild experience. So I couldn't say that I have first-hand knowledge of terrorism because I've never been involved in it or never been a victim of it. but I've had this kind of close thing that grown up with. It was kind of the norm in Britain to see the struggle of the Irish. And of course, I'm from Irish descent too. Now, the outcome of the struggle between a terrorist and a freedom fighter will be generally designated by the history books. I think, Clyde, you would agree. In the end, the victors, as they say, write the history. And the history of Israel, especially for Christians, is an interesting one, because as we read through the Bible, we're introduced to these people of the Jews. And because they are God's people, because God chose them, we have this natural affinity to this group, right? We can't help that. Here we are reading of the people that God chose, and that we are now grafted into that same people group, those that believe in Yahweh and follow him. So it becomes a very murky water when we start to try to differentiate between the modern state of Israel and who the Jews were outlined in the Word of God. The story for the modern birth of the Jews goes something like this, that after World War II, that there was a miracle that took place, that God opened up the doors for the Jews to settle in their own land of history, and everything was great, and the international community recognized that and passed it, and it became a new nation. And of course we know it was also prophesied to be that way in the Bible too. But the reality of how it happened was very different. The British, after World War I, was given this territory called Palestine. And here you can see the whole portion on the right there is what they call the Transjordan, which is part of Jordan today. But this whole area the British were in charge of to keep the peace after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And there were more and more in the 20s, more and more people beginning to relocate to Palestine. And the British tried to keep a handle on the amount that were being emigrated there, because they'd made a deal with the Arabs to say, hey, after this, you will be able to have your own land. So they made this agreement. At the time, Ben Gurion, which was to be the first prime minister of Israel, teamed up with a guy called Menachem Begin. It's not working. And he was a Polish soldier who was stationed in Palestine, but later became the commander of what they called Irgun, which is a paramilitary group for the Jews. And in February 1944, he issued a demand to the British government that the power be handed over to them so that they could set up a temporary Hebrew government. Now, bearing in mind that the British had offered a deal with the Arabs that they could be actually recognized as a country, they refused that. And what happened then after that was Irgun, this paramilitary group, went on to do bombings. And it came to a head, they did many of them during that time. I've lost it, Jay. It came to a head here at the British headquarters, which was inside the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. And 91 people died, including men, women, and children. And it caused a shockwave not only in Britain, but also in the original Jewish settlers that were there. And they feared that any deal of peace that might be made was going to be jeopardized by this group called Irgun. And so they helped the British, they reported to the British some of those that were carrying out these acts. And the British then arrested many of these resistance fighters, and they found inside the kibbutzim, these kibbutz, which were like farming little areas, farms, that they found hidden tunnels and rooms full of weapons. We've heard this recently, right? Isn't it ironic that the Jews did the same thing? They trained for 15 days. Give me the next one, Jay. 15 days to farm, and then 15 days they prepared for a war. They were training for what was coming up. And they found thousands of weapons and rockets and mortars, the British did, when they raided these kibbutzim. The Irgun, after their freedom fighters were captured, they tried to break them out of the prison, and the British hung 3 of them, tried them and hung them. And in retaliation, Irgun captured 2 British sergeants and hung them. They also booby-trapped the bodies. And this caused havoc at home in Britain. They were horrified that the British, who were trying to help maintain the peace, were being attacked by this Jewish paramilitary group. It was also at that time when, in World War II, the British were coming under the potential to be invaded by the Nazis. And they were needing money for the war effort against the Germans. So Attlee, the Prime Minister of Britain, went to the president here in America and asked him for funds. The Americans were funding Europe to help in the war effort. And the Zionists here in America gave them a stipulation and said, unless you allow the Zionist state to happen, you're not going to get any funding for your war effort. And it put Britain in a terrible position, because Britain said, if the Jews are allowed to continue their expansion against the Arabs, then it's going to cause a war. And they didn't want to agree with it. They believed that a much slower process would be possible if peace was going to be maintained. But at that point, the UN got together and made a proposal to say, would it be possible that they could split the land and have a Jewish and a Palestinian state? The Jewish portion here is in blue. The Arab portion was in red, and Jerusalem was going to be an international neutral zone, neither Jew or Arab at that point. A lot of pressure was put on the different countries to vote in favor of this new idea. Let's look at that other clip, Jay, clip 2.
So in the meantime, pressure was brought on the states, on the capitals, and telephones from the Zionists and from Truman to the capitals, to heads of states. Commands came to the members to change their vote. And some of them, like Romulo, had to run away because he was threatened by the Zionists. Haiti's representative began to cry when he was forced to change his vote. Belt of Cuba resigned as a messenger to Washington and to the United States, resigned rather than vote for partition. So Cuba appointed somebody else to vote for partition. The cleanliness of the case was destroyed. It was no more a clean business. You are British, you appreciate sportsmanship and being a clean game. It was no more a clean game. And I said that in the United Nations in 1947. I said the United Nations General Assembly has no jurisdiction and no right to partition a country against the wishes of the inhabitants.
Okay, so the Jews then started to move further into the territories occupied by the Palestinians, and then on the 10th of April 1948, Ergon surrounded a village called Deir Asin. And this is what they, if you've heard the term Nakba, this is how this started. So they surrounded this village, Palestinians, at night, and they raided the village, and 250 men, women, and children were slaughtered. The baker and his son of the village were put into their own oven and burned alive. They did the most appalling things to this village. And the word spread to the other Palestinians who were terrified about what might happen to them. And they fled. 750,000 left. They just left their homes, left everything. And they moved into an area where they thought they would be safe and protected by the British. And they started living in tents. And this was the inception of what we see in Gaza. That's how it started. That's where they were. They stayed there. They began to build. But they left everything that they had. Forced off their land without the protection of the British at that point decided, because the deal had been done in the United Nations, that they would exit. They didn't want to be involved in it. They had reneged on their promise to the Arabs. They double-crossed them, and they left. And the Arabs were left unable to defend themselves. They were farmers. They couldn't defend themselves against those that were being prepared to fight a war and were being funded and supplied weapons by outside sources. They weren't given an opportunity for their own homeland. They were swept off the land. And then obviously in May of 48, the United Nations recognized that the state of Israel was born. But we only hear a very small section of that history. It's a grim history for those that were there. Now the confusion is Judaism the same as Zionism? And we're not allowed to talk about that now, which is interesting. We're not allowed to be critical in any way of what Zionism does, but it is different from Judaism. So Zionism is an atheistic group with a political goal of creating greater Israel. But they don't follow the Bible. They don't. The Israeli Jews follow the Bible, but not Zionists. And you'll see, we'll maybe cover some things further in the future, that being a Zionist doesn't necessarily have anything to do with being Jewish. So it's important that we separate the two things. Jews conquered Jericho, if you remember. Did they do it in their own might? No. True or false? No, they didn't. Did Gideon, when the Gideon's 300, when they faced the Midianites, did they do it in their own strength? No, they didn't. They won tremendous battles over their enemies, but does that prove that God is on their side? This is a really important question. If the Jews won battles, does that mean God was on their side? It actually means, the correct answer is no, and I'll show you why. When Jericho fell, they moved on to another city called Ai. Do you remember that? And Joshua took the men out, and they were defeated and humiliated in front of Ai. And Joshua cries out and asks the Lord, "Why did this happen, Lord?" And the Lord replies and he says, "Get up, why have you fallen on your face? Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant that I've commanded. And they have taken some of the devoted things and stolen and lied and put them among their own belongings. Therefore, the people of Israel cannot stand before their enemies." And it goes on to say, "I will be with you no more unless you destroy the devoted things among you." The deal God made with them was, if they were faithful if they followed the laws that he commanded them to and put him first, then he would enable them to dwell in the land. But the second part of that contract is if they reneged on that and did their own thing, he told them he would expel them from the land. Is that not true? It's true. Nowhere does it say that the Jewish nation have a right to the land if they disobeyed God. Nowhere. You won't find that. And it's very important to understand that God is not on anyone's side. God is not on anyone's side. Once we believe that God is on our side, and you can hear Christians do the same thing, is what you're doing is making an idol of God. You're fashioning God in your own image, and you're pulling him out of your pocket when you want to use him for a certain thing. God is not on anyone's side. We either are obedient and we're going to be blessed, or we are disobedient and we're going to be cursed. Let's see the last clip, Jay. This is from a rabbi in Britain.
Just
Yeah, what does it say?
here is just a crown, that means the crown of the Torah. And here is just the beginning of each, the 10 Commandments.
Does the state of Israel break any of the 10 commandments?
The 6th, don't kill. The 8th, don't steal. The basic of the Jewish religion is to trust God. If God send us in exile, stay in exile. We have to wait for the coming of Messiah.
So is that why the Neturei Karta believe that Israel is against God?
100%, yes, of course.
So coming back to our scripture then, Luke 21:20, it says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near." What we can do, there's a couple of interpretations of this passage to say that either there is this preterism, which means that everything has already taken place, that in AD 70 Jerusalem was sacked, it was destroyed, and that even the book of Revelation has come to pass, and that we are living in the millennial reign. That's preterism. It means everything's in the past. Or simplistically, that you believe in futurism, that these things have somewhat taken place, which they have, but there is more to come. So our position, or at least my position, would be, I'm a futurist. This will happen. But when we read the Bible often, we have to make sure that we don't read into something good when it isn't good. I.e., just because it mentions Israel, it doesn't mean to say that Israel was doing what was right. Do we understand that? So here, we can look at that position and immediately think that Jerusalem is the victim, but that might not necessarily be the case. So it says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near." So it's coming, it's getting ready. "For these are days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written." It's saying that vengeance and judgment is coming to Israel itself, not the armies around them. The Lord is going to use the armies against Jerusalem themselves. And it says that they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles. And here's why I believe it's a future event, because it says there, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. We all understand, at least most scholars agree, that we're in the time of the Gentiles. So this will put this event in the future. The time of Gentiles is not fulfilled yet, but you can see here that the sacking of Jerusalem is going to take place. Okay. You can look at Hosea 9, Isaiah 34 if you wanted to get more context on judgment that's going to be laid out on Jerusalem at the end time. So having seen what's taking place, and also having seen the rhetoric here of the conservative position saying that Israel can do no wrong, and looking at the position of most of the world's press in that what Israel is doing without allowing aid to come into Palestine is invoking rage of the planet against the Jews. I don't necessarily agree that that be right or wrong. I'm just saying that this is a picture that's kind of unfolding at the moment. And I feel as though when I see that taking place, that are we moving closer to this picture here because of the actions of what's taking place? Now, they would say for security reasons they need to do that. But I would say to them, well, then apology needs to be given to the British soldiers and the American soldiers who lost their legs and arms through IDEs, having to patrol on foot in places like Iraq and Afghanistan for the last 2 decades, blown up, because if they had an option to carpet bomb those countries from the air, do you not think they would have done that? Why would they have put their own soldiers at risk by putting them on the ground? Because that was the morally right thing to do. You cannot just carte blanche kill citizens in a time of war in that situation. So I believe Israel is wrong in this situation. I believe it's wrong. I do. And it's a deeply unpopular position here in America, but I think biblically it is a sound position. If Israel bends its knee to the Lord himself will protect that nation. Do we believe that? Time and time throughout Israel's history, when they slid away from him, they started to worship other gods, and they came back, he gave them victory against his enemies, against their enemies, because they were obedient. And at the moment, Israel has not been obedient. So, doesn't mean to say I'm an anti-Semite. Doesn't mean to say I'm critical of Israel. Just trying to put a picture here that if you were to listen to news outside of the States, you will see a growing movement that is becoming more and more hostile towards Israel because of the actions that it's taking. And I believe that will go some way to fulfilling this prophecy here. Let us pray.